The first thing Boone Carter noticed wasn't the children. It was the silence. The storm had howled for 12 straight hours, a screaming devil that tried to rip his small cabin from its foundations. And then, nothing. An eerie, unnatural calm settled over the land as the sun broke through the bruised clouds. He'd pulled the 2 native children from the churning river just before midnight. They should have been terrified, grateful, anything but what they were. They were calm. Too calm. They stood in the dirt yard, their small fingers tracing the same strange symbol over and over again in the mud, a pattern of wavy lines cut through by a single straight mark. The girl, no older than 8, clutched a small leather pouch at her neck like it was her own heart. The boy, maybe 6, had eyes that were ancient. He looked at Boone not like a man who had just saved his life, but like a man who was walking into a trap. Boone thought the worst was over. He was wrong, because in that deafening sunrise silence, he heard it. A low, rhythmic thunder that wasn't from the sky. It was the sound of horses, hundreds of them. The ground itself began to vibrate. The children stopped their drawing. They didn't look scared. They looked up, toward the horizon, with a look of pure recognition. They had been waiting for this. And that's when Boone understood. The symbol wasn't a child's game. It was a summons, a message. He scrambled back inside, grabbing the old rifle from above the door. His hands shook as he checked the chamber. 3 bullets. He had 3 bullets left to face an army. He peered through the window and his blood ran cold. Pouring over the ridge was a river of men and horses, warriors painted for battle, moving in perfect, terrifying formation. At their head rode a man who sat on his horse like a king on a throne, his feathers catching the new light. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was an invasion, and the reason for it was standing right beside him. Boone had lived on this land for 8 years, ever since his wife Ruth passed. He'd kept to himself, traded fairly with the local tribes, respected their boundaries. He'd never had a single problem. Until now. The answer to why 100 warriors were about to descend on his ranch stood right next to him, clutching the leg of his trousers. 2 children he'd pulled from a raging river. Children who clearly belonged to someone very, very important. The boy tugged on his sleeve, pointing frantically toward the root cellar behind the cabin. He wanted them to hide, but hiding would look like guilt. Hiding would be a confession. How do you explain to 100 armed men that you're a savior, not a kidnapper? The girl shook her head, her expression firm. She walked to the front door, placed her small palm flat against the wood, and looked back at Boone. Her eyes weren't asking for protection. They were demanding he face what was coming. The vibration from the hooves was now a physical force, shaking the floorboards beneath his feet. He could see their faces now. Grim. Unforgiving. And leading them all was the chief, a man who had no way of knowing if the stranger in the cabin had saved his children, or stolen them. The lead warrior raised a single hand, and the entire army of horses stopped as one. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the thunder. Boone made his choice. He stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held low, not aiming, but visible. He would not cower like a guilty man. The children moved to stand on either side of him. It was a strange sight. A lone rancher, flanked by 2 small children, facing 100 warriors. The chief dismounted with a single fluid motion. He was younger than Boone expected, his arms covered in scars that told stories of battles Boone couldn't imagine. His eyes weren't just angry, they were cold. They swept across the small cabin, the empty corral, the sad little garden Ruth had planted so many years ago. His gaze took in every detail of Boone's poor, lonely life. Then, those eyes landed on Boone, and in them, Boone saw his own death. This was a man who held the power of life and death in his hands, a man who was used to being obeyed. This was a man who had come for blood. But then the chief's gaze fell upon his children, and for a single fleeting moment, the warrior vanished. His face cracked, and a wave of raw, undeniable relief washed over him. He looked, for just a second, like any father in the world who had found what he thought was lost forever. The girl broke from Boone's side, running across the dirt yard. "Papa!" The word, though in a language he didn't know, was unmistakable. The chief dropped to one knee, catching both his son and daughter in a fierce embrace, burying his face in their hair. Boone could hear him whispering to them, soft, desperate sounds that needed no translation. A few of the warriors behind him visibly relaxed their grip on their weapons. But the moment was brief. The chief stood up, his children clinging to his legs, and his expression hardened once more as he looked at Boone. He spoke in slow, careful English, his voice laced with steel. "I am Kestrel of the Northern Wind. These are my children." Boone's own voice was tight in his throat. "I'm Boone Carter. I pulled them from the river, during the storm." Kestrel's eyes narrowed to slits. "My children do not go near the river alone. They know its danger." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. If they didn't go to the river alone, then someone must have taken them there, someone like the lone white rancher who just happened to live right beside it. The girl, whose name Boone would later learn was Ayanna, began speaking rapidly to her father. She gestured wildly, pointing at Boone, then at the river, then up at the sky where the storm had raged. She was telling the story, her small voice rising and falling with the drama of the night before. Boone's entire life, his very existence, now rested on the words of an 8-year-old girl, words he couldn't even understand. Kestrel listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When she finally finished, he didn't look at Boone. Instead, he knelt down and looked at the small leather pouch she had clutched so tightly. With incredible care, he opened it. He tipped the contents into his palm. It was a small piece of carved bone, yellowed with age. As Kestrel stared at it, the color drained from his face. Whatever that small piece of bone was, it changed everything. His posture, his breathing, his entire being seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, charged with a new, more dangerous energy. The chief rose slowly, and when he looked at Boone this time, it wasn't with gratitude or even suspicion. It was with a kind of dawning horror that made the hair on Boone's arms stand on end. "Where?" Kestrel asked, his voice now a deadly quiet whisper. "Did you find my children?" Boone swallowed hard. "About 2 miles downstream. They were caught in the rocks near Devil's Bend." Kestrel's jaw clenched so tight Boone could hear the muscles grind. "Devil's Bend is sacred ground," he hissed. "No one goes there, especially not children." He held up the small piece of bone, and it seemed to pulse in the morning light. "Someone sent them there," he said, his voice trembling with a barely controlled rage. "Someone who wanted them to find this." Kestrel held the carved bone aloft for his warriors to see. A ripple of unease went through the ranks of mounted men. They began to murmur to each other in their own tongue, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. Whatever that thing was, it was powerful. It held a meaning that went far beyond a simple grave marker. "This," Kestrel announced, his voice echoing across the silent yard, "belonged to my father. He was buried with it at Devil's Bend 3 winters ago, as is our custom." The bottom dropped out of Boone's stomach. His children didn't just wander onto sacred ground. They had found a grave. They were not found. Kestrel's voice was like grinding stones. They were led. Someone told them exactly where to dig. Someone who knows our customs, our sacred places, our language. The pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place, forming a picture so monstrous Boone could barely comprehend it. Someone had used these children, manipulated them into desecrating a grave, knowing the storm would hit, knowing they would be swept into the river, knowing that the only person close enough to save them was him, a white rancher. "You think I sent them?" Boone asked, his voice barely a whisper. The answer shocked him. No, Kestrel said flatly. You are not clever enough for such a plan, and your eyes do not hold the lies of a man who would do this. He took a step closer to Boone, the bone still resting in his palm like a loaded gun. But someone wants me to believe that you are. Someone who knows that finding my father's grave marker in your possession would demand a blood payment. Boone's throat was as dry as dust. Blood payment? Our law is absolute, Kestrel said, his dark eyes burning into Boone's. To disturb the sacred rest of a chief, your life is forfeit. The warriors behind him grunted in agreement. The sentence was passed. The law was the law. That, Kestrel continued, his voice dropping even lower, is why they chose this bone. They wanted me to ride here with 100 warriors and kill you on your own porch. The sheer evil of the plan was breathtaking. It was a perfect trap, and Boone had walked right into it. Just then, the girl, Ayanna, tugged at her father's sleeve, speaking urgently. She pointed a small finger towards the rolling hills beyond Boone's property, then made a gesture that looked like someone hiding, watching from a distance. Kestrel's face grew even more grim. Ayanna says someone followed them to the river. A man on a horse, hidden in the trees. She thought he was a hunter. He paused, letting the weight of the next words sink in. But now we know. He wasn't hunting, he was watching, making sure they found what he planted for them. And making sure they nearly drowned, so I'd be forced to save them, Boone finished, the horror dawning on him. Bringing my father's bone into your house, Kestrel added, making you an unwilling accomplice to sacrilege. Boone raked a hand through his hair, his mind reeling. Someone wanted me dead, but why me? I have nothing. That is what we must find out, Kestrel said. He turned and barked a series of commands to his men. Instantly, half the warriors wheeled their horses around and galloped toward the hills, fanning out to search for tracks. You believe them? Boone asked, gesturing to the children. You believe this whole story? Ayanna has her grandmother's eyes, Kestrel said simply. She sees what others miss. And Takakota. He glanced at his son, who was now staring intently at the symbol they had drawn in the dirt. He remembers everything, exactly as it happened. As if on cue, the boy looked up. He pointed at his own face, then spoke in broken, halting English. Man. Had scar. Here. He traced a long, thin line down his left cheek. Kestrel froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. What did you say? The boy repeated the gesture. Scar Man told us. Grandfather's spirit calling from river. The chief's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Several of the nearby warriors heard the boy's words and instinctively reached for their weapons, their faces contorting with a sudden, violent anger. You know who he is, Boone stated. It wasn't a question. Yes, the word came out as a low, guttural growl. And if I am right, this was never about you at all. At that moment, a lone warrior came charging back from the hills, shouting as he rode. Kestrel listened, his face darkening with every word. When the rider finished, the chief turned back to Boone. They found tracks, he said, his voice flat and cold. A single horse, wearing iron shoes, heading east toward Millfield. Boone knew the town. It was a 2-day ride, the seat of the territorial government, the place where land disputes were settled. Who is the man with the scar? Boone pressed. Kestrel was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his children, as if to burn their images into his soul. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with an old, deep pain. His name is Marcus Gann. He was a translator. He worked for the territorial government during the treaty negotiations 5 years ago. He paused. He worked for them until we discovered he was changing our words. The treaties we signed, the ones we believed protected our sacred lands and hunting grounds, they were lies. He translated them as a surrender of our rights to the river, to Devil's Bend. The pieces were clicking together, forming a picture of betrayal on a massive scale. When we protested, Kestrel continued, his jaw tight, the government officials claimed we had agreed to the terms. It was Gon's word against ours, a translator's word against a chief's. His voice was laced with bitterness. But my father was at every meeting. He was wise. He kept his own records, in our own language. Records that prove Gan's translations were deliberate fraud. Kestrel held up the carved bone again, its markings seeming to glow with significance. Records that were buried with him. This bone. This is the key. It contains the marks that reference those documents. Gon knew that if anyone ever found my father's resting place and understood what was buried there, his great deception would be revealed. His entire career, the land he stole for the government. All of it would be undone. The full scope of the plan was now horrifyingly clear. So he uses your own children to disturb the grave, Boone said, thinking aloud. He puts the evidence in my hands, knowing that by your law, you'd have no choice but to kill me. The only witness is eliminated, and the real evidence of his crime, your father's records, remains buried forever. And while my warriors are occupied avenging a crime you did not commit, Kestrel finished, his gaze turning toward the east, he rides to Millfield to file claims on more of our land, using the very treaties he forged. Just then, Ayanna ran to her father's side, whispering something urgently in his ear. Kestrel's face contorted with a fresh wave of fury. "What is it?" Boone asked. Kestrel's voice was barely a whisper, shaking with rage. Gan told them. He told them that if they brought the bone to the white rancher by the river, their grandfather's spirit would finally be at peace. He used their love, their innocence, their faith, to turn them into pawns in his twisted game. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted the tense silence. Everyone turned. The search party was returning from the hills. And they were not alone. Trotting between two mounted warriors was a man on a tired-looking horse, his hands bound tightly behind his back. Even from a distance, Boone could see the long, pale scar that sliced down his left cheek. Marcus Gan hadn't made it to Millfield after all. As the warriors brought him into the yard, Gan's eyes darted between Kestrel and Boone, his mind clearly working, calculating, searching for an escape. When he spoke, his voice was as smooth as river stone, the confident tone of a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. "Chief Kestrel," he began, feigning relief. "Thank heavens. I've been searching for your children since the storm broke. I am so glad to see they are safe." Kestrel took a slow, deliberate step forward. Every single warrior tensed, their focus zeroed in on the captured man. "You have been searching for them?" Kestrel asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Of course," Gan replied without hesitation. "When I saw the storm rolling in, I became concerned they might have wandered too far from your village. I've been riding all night and all morning, checking every homestead. It was a good lie, a plausible lie. If it weren't for a little boy's perfect memory and a little girl's sharp eyes, it might even have worked." Kestrel walked until he was just an arm's length from Gon's horse. "My son says you spoke to them yesterday," he said softly. "He says you told them their grandfather's spirit was calling to them from the river." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Gan's face. "Children?" he said with a condescending chuckle. "They have such active imaginations. The storm must have frightened him. He's likely confused." "Show him," Kestrel commanded. One of the warriors dismounted, walked to Gon's horse, and unstrapped his saddlebags. He dumped the contents onto the dirt. A pile of official-looking territorial documents, surveying tools, and another leather pouch, identical to the one Ayanna wore. Kestrel bent down, picked up the pouch, and opened it. Inside were more carved bones, dozens of them. Gon's face went white as Kestrel spread the bones out on the ground. Each one was marked with ancient symbols, symbols that clearly belonged to his people, symbols that belonged in the earth with the ancestors. "I can explain this," Gan stammered, his composure finally shattering. "I found these, scattered along the riverbank, after the flood. I was gathering them to return them to you, of course. I know how important they are." Kestrel picked up one of the bones, turning it over and over in his hand. "This," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "belonged to my grandfather's grandfather. It has not seen the sun in more than 60 years. He looked up, his eyes burning holes into Gan. "You have been robbing our graves. That's a vile accusation. Be silent!" Kestrel's command was like the crack of a whip, cutting through Gan's protests. He turned to his son. "Takakota, tell this man what he told you yesterday." The little boy stepped forward, his small voice ringing with perfect, unshakable clarity. "Scarman said, 'Grandfather's bones make powerful medicine for white settlers.' Said, 'If we bring them to Rancher Man, we get reward money.'" The boy's eyes, full of an innocence Gan had tried to corrupt, stared directly at him. "Said grandfather wants his bones to help us." Gan's face crumbled. His careful web of lies was being torn apart by a 6-year-old boy. "He's confused," he pleaded. "He doesn't understand these things." Kestrel ignored him. "Ayana, what else did this man tell you?" The girl spoke in clear, carefully pronounced English, her voice steady and strong. "He said you would be proud of us. He said bringing the bones to the white man would show that we trust the white people, that it would make peace." The sheer, cynical cruelty of the manipulation was stunning. He had twisted their love for their family, their desire for peace, their innocent trust, into weapons for his own greed. Boone couldn't stay silent any longer, his own anger boiling over. "You used children," he snarled. "You used them to rob graves and then set them up to die, also you could get me killed for your own damn crimes." Gan sneered, a sliver of his arrogance returning. "You don't understand the complexities of territorial law, Rancher. These artifacts belong in a museum, not rotting in the ground. I was preserving history." "Whose history?" Kestrel asked quietly. "American history," Gan shot back, his mask of civility slipping away completely. "Civilized history. This land is going to be developed. These primitive burial customs can't be allowed to stand in the way of progress." Several warriors surged forward at the insult, their weapons raised, but Kestrel held up a hand, stopping them. "You forged treaties," Boone said, the accusation hanging in the air. "You changed the words to steal their land." "I corrected the translations," Gan replied defiantly. "I made them reflect the reality of the situation. I simply helped history along." He then made his final, fatal mistake. He looked directly at Kestrel, his lip curled in a contemptuous sneer. "Your father was a stubborn old fool. He couldn't accept that his time was over, that his world was ending." The words hit the tense air like a spark on gunpowder. Boone saw Kestrel's hand drop to the knife at his belt. He saw the murder in his eyes. But before the chief could move, before anyone could react, a shout came from the warrior posted as a lookout. More riders, approaching fast from the east, from the direction of Millfield. They wore the uniforms of the territorial government. A smile of pure relief spread across Gan's face. "You see?" he said, his voice dripping with triumph. "The proper authorities are here now. This entire matter will be handled through official channels." Kestrel looked from the approaching officials to the damning evidence in his hands, then back to the smirking man in his custody. "Perhaps," he said softly, "but first they will hear exactly what you have done." Gan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "My word against that of a bunch of savages and a dirt-poor rancher? I think I'll take my chances." But his laughter died in his throat when he saw Boone slowly pull a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. It was the territorial survey notice that had been nailed to his fence post just last week. A notice authorizing a land assessment. A notice bearing the official signature of one Marcus Gann. The territorial officials, led by a heavy-set man with silver hair and a chest full of badges, rode into the tense standoff like they owned the world. "I'm Commissioner Walsh," the man announced, his eyes taking in the scene with open disapproval. "We got a report about an armed gathering out here disturbing the peace." Gann immediately seized his chance. "Commissioner, thank God you're here," he cried out, playing the victim perfectly. "These men have taken me prisoner. They're making wild accusations, threatening my life over some old bones." Walsh's gaze shifted from the 100 warriors to the bound translator, and finally to Boone, who was still standing protectively beside the two children. "Mr. Gann, your survey reports were due in Millfield yesterday. When you didn't show, we came looking." "As you can see, Commissioner," Gann said with a pained expression, "I was unavoidably detained." Kestrel stepped forward, holding the carved bones out for the commissioner to see. "Commissioner Walsh, this man has been desecrating our sacred burial sites. He used my own children to do it." "Preposterous!" Gann interjected. "This is nothing more than an attempt to interfere with lawful territorial business. They're angry about the new land assessments. That's all this is." Walsh looked at the bones with a flicker of interest. "These do look like significant artifacts, Mr. Gann. Are they part of your official survey?" "I found them," Gann said smoothly. "Scattered by the flood. I was collecting them to bring to the proper authorities for cataloging when I was ambushed." It was a solid story, but it had a hole. Boone stepped forward, holding out the folded paper. "Commissioner, this survey notice has Mr. Gann's signature. It authorizes an assessment of my property, right here, for potential territorial acquisition." Walsh took the paper, his eyes scanning the official text. "Yes, this appears to be in order." "The survey was conducted yesterday," Boone continued, laying the trap. "But according to Mr. Gann, he was out searching for the chief's missing children all night, and only found these artifacts by accident this morning. He couldn't have been doing both." The contradiction landed with a thud. Walsh looked from the official document to Gann, his expression hardening. "Mr. Gann, your timeline seems confused. When exactly did you perform this survey?" There may be a misunderstanding about the dates," Gann stammered. "There is no confusion," a small voice said. It was Ayanna. She stepped forward, her dark eyes fixed on Walsh. "Scarman came to our village 3 days ago. He told us the story about our grandfather's bones. He told us to bring them to the white man by the river." Walsh's full attention snapped to the little girl. "You're saying Mr. Gann was in your village 3 days ago?" "Yes," Takakota added, his voice small but firm. "Before the big storm. He told us a secret, about the bones making peace." The commissioner's face darkened as the pieces began to connect in his mind. He turned back to Gann, his voice dangerously low. "Mr. Gann, if you were in the tribal village 3 days ago, and you were supposedly searching for these children all day yesterday, I ask you again, when did you have time to conduct an official survey of this man's property?" Gann's lies were collapsing around him. "The children are mistaken. The trauma of being lost, it's affected their memories." "Both of them?" Walsh asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "With the exact same false memory?" "Commissioner," Kestrel said quietly, "there is more you need to see." One of his warriors came forward with Gann's saddlebags and laid out the rest of the contents for Walsh to inspect. More documents detailing the locations of other burial sites, hand-drawn maps to sacred caves, and the most damning piece of evidence of all, a ledger. A list of names of territorial officials, and next to each name, a number. A payment. For looking the other way. For rubber-stamping fraudulent claims. Walsh's own name was not on the list, but the names of several of his deputies were. The commissioner's face went chalk white. He looked up from the ledger, his eyes filled with the fury of a man who has just discovered a nest of snakes in his own house. "Mr. Gann," he said, his voice trembling with rage, "these documents suggest a systematic conspiracy of grave robbery, fraud, and official corruption." "Those are research notes," Gann pleaded, "for an academic study." But it was over. The evidence was absolute. The contradictions were irrefutable. Walsh looked like a man who had just been stabbed in the back by his own people. "Marcus Gann," he announced, his voice booming across the yard, "you are under arrest for fraud, grand theft of cultural artifacts, and corruption of territorial proceedings." As Walsh's men moved in to put him in official restraints, Gann made one last, desperate gamble. "Commissioner, you're making a terrible mistake. They've coerced the rancher. This is a conspiracy to undermine the United States government and halt territorial expansion." Walsh simply held up the ledger. "Mr. Gann, this is your handwriting. This lists payments you personally received. The children's testimony is flawless. And this rancher," he glanced at Boone, "seems to be the only honest man here." "Children can be coached," Gann screamed. "By who?" Walsh shot back. "A poor rancher who's been here for 8 years without a single complaint against him? By a chief who didn't even know you were robbing his ancestors blind until this morning?" Gann's face twisted into a mask of pure hate. His final lie had failed. "Fine!" he spat, the venom pouring out of him. "Yes, I altered the translations. I took the artifacts. But I did it to protect American interests from these primitive savages who refuse to accept progress." The confession, raw and ugly, hung in the silent air. Kestrel stepped forward, his composure absolute, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "Commissioner Walsh, by your own laws, this man has just confessed to his crimes. What is the penalty?" "Prison," Walsh said, his voice grim. "He will face a territorial court. He'll serve many years. And the treaties." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "The lands he stole through fraud. That will require a lengthy legal review. It could take years to untangle." "And while your lawyers review," Kestrel said, his quiet words more powerful than any shout, "my people will continue to live without the land where our ancestors are buried." The commissioner had no answer. The law could punish the criminal, but it was slow to deliver true justice. It was then that Boone heard himself speak, the words forming before he'd even thought them through. What if there was another way? Every eye in the yard turned to him. "My property," Boone said, looking from Walsh to Kestrel. "It borders the river for 3 miles. It includes the access to Devil's Bend. I never asked for that. I never wanted to own another people's sacred ground." "What are you suggesting, Mr. Carter?" Walsh asked. "A trade," Boone said simply. "Instead of years in court, let's just correct the boundaries. Right now, give back what was stolen." Kestrel stared at Boone, his expression one of profound, stunned respect. "You would? Give up your land?" "It was never my land to begin with," Boone said, gesturing to the small cabin, the empty corral. "It was just a place I was lonely. I don't need 3 miles of river. I never did." "But where would you go?" Walsh asked, bewildered. Boone looked at the 2 children who were now standing close to him again, looking up at him with trusting eyes. He'd been thinking about that ever since he'd felt their small, cold hands in his. "I've been alone on this ranch for 3 years. Ever since my wife passed. Maybe it's time I stopped living that way." Ayanna tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered something in his ear. A slow smile spread across Kestrel's face, the first genuine smile Boone had seen on the man. "My daughter asks," Kestrel said, his voice filled with a new warmth, "if the man who saved their lives would consider becoming part of our family." The offer hit Boone with the force of a physical blow. Family, a word he thought he'd lost forever. "What? What would that mean?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. It means a home in our village, Kestrel said. It means work that has meaning. It means children who already look to you as a protector. He glanced down at his son and daughter. And it means a chance to help us build a bridge, to make sure no other Marcus Gann can ever again harm either of our peoples. Walsh watched the exchange, a look of immense relief on his face. This was a solution no court could have ever ordered, a solution born not of law, but of honor. "Mr. Carter," he said formally, "are you certain?" Boone looked at his small, empty cabin, a monument to his grief. He looked at the fence line that had marked the boundary of his isolation, and then he looked at the children, at the chief, at the chance for a life that wasn't empty anymore. "Commissioner," Boone Carter said, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." 3 months later, Boone sat on the grassy bank of the river at Devil's Bend. The sacred burial ground had been restored, the stolen artifacts returned to their eternal rest. Down in the shallows, Ayanna and Takakota splashed and laughed under the watchful eye of their grandmother. Commissioner Walsh had been a man of his word. Marcus Gann was serving a 5-year sentence in the territorial prison, and the corrupt officials named in his ledger had been dismissed in disgrace. The fraudulent treaties were declared null and void, and the land, this sacred land, was formally returned to Kestrel's people. Boone's old cabin still stood, but now it served a new purpose. Kestrel had declared it a neutral meeting ground, a place where the tribal council and the territorial government could meet as equals to negotiate in honesty and good faith. "You are thinking too hard again, my friend," Kestrel said, sitting down on the grass beside him. "Just remembering," Boone said, watching the children. Their laughter was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. "When I pulled them out of that water, I thought I was just saving 2 kids. You saved more than that," Kestrel said, his gaze following Boone's. "You saved my family. You saved our sacred land. You saved the truth. I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Kestrel's voice was firm. "Anyone would have jumped in the river. But not everyone would have had the courage to trust when 100 warriors came to his door. Not everyone would have given up what was his, to make right a wrong that was not his own." Boone smiled. "Best trade I ever made." And it was true. His new life was richer than any land deed. He was helping Kestrel negotiate fair trade agreements, ensuring the tribe was never cheated again. He was teaching the children to read English, and in return, they were patiently teaching him their language. He had become what Kestrel called a bridge builder, a man who stood in 2 worlds to help them become one. "Papa Boone," Ayanna called from the river's edge. "Come look, we found something." The 2 men walked over. The children were pointing at a small depression in the sand. "It is a turtle nest," Takakota announced, carefully pronouncing his English words. "Grandmother says the babies will hatch when the leaves turn color." "Just like you found us," Ayanna added, a wide grin on her face. "In the water, waiting to be saved." Boone knelt down, looking at the precious hidden eggs. New life, waiting for the right moment to emerge, just as his own new life had emerged from the chaos of that storm. "We'll have to protect them," he said softly. "Make sure they're safe until their time comes." "Just like you protected us," Ayanna said, and she took his hand. Kestrel put his hand on Boone's shoulder. "Come," he said. "The council meets soon. They want to hear the bridge builder's thoughts on the new trading post." As they walked back toward the village, Boone glanced back one last time at the river, the place where it all began. The lonely rancher who thought his life was over had found a family. The 100 warriors who rode for blood had found justice instead. Sometimes, he thought, the greatest storms bring the greatest gifts, and sometimes the simple act of pulling 2 children from a river can be enough to heal a broken world. If you enjoyed this story of courage and redemption, click the video on your screen now for another incredible tale from the frontier that you won't want to miss. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. because stories like this are what we do best. Your support means we can keep bringing them to you.